Both the inner and outer planets get their meaning from the myths associated with the gods they're named after. And that's the end of the story for the inner planets. But when it comes to the outer planets, we need another layer of information because they not only express in the individual birth chart, but they're also experienced by the collective. The movements of the outer planets influence the attitudes and behaviors of entire generations. When Pluto was discovered in 1930, astrologers had been through a divining process twice before with the outer planets Uranus and Neptune. Both Uranus and Neptune got part of their meaning from the myths associated with those gods, but they also got part of their meaning from the events going on in the West at the time each one entered human awareness. When Pluto came into the wheel in 1930, astrologers scrambled to gather data. Exactly what events were taking place in the West? What zeitgeist was infusing the new planet? What was that new planet's meaning? Unfortunately, astrologers were missing something they needed to complete this task: the passage of time. Time allows us to pick up patterns and themes. 20 years of historical events on either side of Neptune's discovery gave us enough information to glean Neptune's character. In the case of Pluto, not quite as much time was necessary. Partly that was because the world was beginning to speed up in a way we would consider modern. Moreover, there was higher literacy, better record keeping, and even audio-visual proof of events. We get all we need to know about Pluto's character from a 30-year period, and so I'm proclaiming Pluto's era of discovery as the years between 1915 and 1945. Pluto's character was shaped permanently by these three tempestuous decades. But here's something important to understand. When we look at events around the discovery of an outer planet, we don't look at everything that happened, only the distinctive things that happened. For instance, Pluto's era of discovery coincided with a rise of fascist governments. But that kind of rise has occurred many times throughout history in many forms. We only want to look at the unique things that occurred as Pluto entered human consciousness. Between 1915 and 1945, there was a tremendous amount of unique change going on. In fact, so much was happening socially, technologically, and psychologically. It's a difficult story to unfold in an organized way. However, we can always use Pluto's keywords as a guide. Keywords boil a planet down to its bare bones. In the case of Pluto, the keywords are destruction, control, death and rebirth, extremes, the masses, power, sexuality, the underworld, transformation, and the collective unconscious. Let's begin with the last keywords on the list: collective unconscious. I want to start here because I will be referring to this idea throughout our exploration of Pluto's discovery era. The concept of a collective unconscious was a truly unique change in how the human mind was perceived. Likewise, the collective unconscious itself is the sponge that absorbed Pluto's character out of the events of the time and still holds on to it today. Freud and the idea of a personal unconscious were associated with Neptune's discovery. Freud, under Neptune's influence, said there was a part of the mind that drives what we do, and yet of which we are unaware. This was a remarkable idea that began a dive into the human mind like never before. Freud and a student named Carl Jung worked together with many others, building a field of study. But at the beginning of Pluto's discovery era, something dramatic occurred. The two scholars bitterly broke off their relationship. This fracture allowed Carl Jung to dive even more deeply into an even more mysterious and plutonic level of the mind, the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious was much bigger than the personal unconscious. It encompassed the soul of humanity at large. I'm not sure this idea would have been accepted at any other time in history, but there was something special brewing in the Western world. A period of intense collectivity was taking hold. Prior to Pluto, life was relatively local and people were relatively isolated. But thanks to Pluto, a few technologies came about that changed everything. Those were mass marketing, mass media, and mass production. Mass media was very powerful. It still is. When Pluto came, it brought moving pictures and the cinema. Then it brought the radio into people's homes. It brought newspapers and magazines that had huge national circulations. And these periodicals allowed for mass marketing, being able to talk to huge audiences about products. Pluto brought mechanized, illuminated factories that made exactly the same product with exactly the same ingredients, made exactly the same way, and packaged to look the same with the same branding. There was a jingle on the radio that everyone recognized. A cereal called Wheaties was now in the collective awareness.
Just like Wheaties, the best breakfast food in the land.
It was also a time when people were moving around more easily. Pluto brought more cars and more paved roads, more train tracks, more passenger trains, and wherever you went, you could ask for popular products. Modern people live with a very deep collective awareness, but when Pluto arrived, it was just beginning. A mass culture was being created by the day. And just imagine, for the very first time, a person could get on a passenger train in Boston. And in St. Louis, someone else could get on, and you could both order Wheaties and get exactly the same thing made the same way from the same manufacturer. You could talk about the latest film together. You had both, for the very first time in history, seen exactly the same portrayal on the silver screen. And the same announcer on the radio was known to all. The hand cream you all saw advertised in Life magazine could be found in any big store, anywhere from Miami to San Francisco. People got exactly the same amount of every ingredient in exactly the same container. They saw the same newsreels, heard the same radio stories. Whether you were in New York or Baltimore, you could eat the same Wonder Bread for breakfast, drive the same car to work, read the same cinema magazine on your break, put on the same hand cream, listen to the same radio show, hear the same Ovaltine commercial, and lay down in the same mass-produced bedding that night. Mass production of everything from lamps to shoes to cars allowed items to fly off the conveyor belts at lower prices, so people of lower socioeconomic classes could now have luxury items. This was a unifying event as well. This mass experience is why Pluto is known as the planet of the masses. It rang in a time when we could have a more similar experience of life than ever before, no matter where we were. Our lives today are full of mass production and branding from the moment we get up to the moment we go to sleep. So it might actually take some imagination to think of a time when every single thing purchased was made by hand or in limited edition, and nothing could be counted on to be the same each time you purchased it. Mass media is everywhere today, but when Pluto arrived, we got that mass media for the first time. Cinema, the radio, photographs, national cartoons, all of these things actually showed what was in the human collective mind, what appealed to the collective awareness, and what was in the collective unconscious. We got stories that provoked similar feelings and similar fears. We started to have the experience of being a collective when Pluto arrived. Now, let's take a look at a keyword you can never get around when it comes to Pluto, and that is destruction. There was definitely a dark side to technological advancement and mass production. That brings me to the years I chose as Pluto's era of discovery. Why did I select 1915 as the beginning of Pluto's time? It's actually a mean year, a roundabout number, because a cluster of plutonic events started, were developing, or peaked around that time. But the main destruction around 1915 was World War I. I have already said that we are going over only the distinctive events surrounding Pluto. Well, there's nothing distinctive about war itself. There was definitely something distinctive about World War I. The unusual part of it was that it was the first war that brought technology to the battlefield. Never before had anyone seen advances in weaponry that caused that kind of destruction and loss of human life. For the first time, war could include the safe use of electricity and a reliable engine. Weaponry became more powerful, artillery could fly further, and more importantly, War could leave the ground. The invention of the airplane meant gunners could be sent into the air. Bombs could drop from the sky. Soldiers with parachutes could be positioned behind enemy lines. Other new items were flamethrowers, tanks, grenades, poison gas. War was always nasty, but World War I was different. It was so massive and so devastating in the eyes of those watching. It was called the Great War. It was known as the war to end all wars. But World War I did take war from the hands of Mars and place it into the darker hands of Pluto. Swords and shields, cannonballs, and muskets belonged to Mars. How much destruction could really be done with a musket? With World War I came the light portable machine gun. A single soldier could pin down the enemy with an extremely high rate of fire and much more blood and guts. In astrology, Pluto is known as the higher octave of Mars. But when you turn it over and look at the underbelly, you might say that Pluto is also the lower octave of Mars. Pluto is the more destructive, gorier vibration of the planet of war. So 1915 represents the Great War, the worst war in history to that time. Why did I select 1945 as the end of Pluto's era of discovery? Because that's associated with one thing astrologers never fail to mention in connection with Pluto's arrival in human consciousness. I'm talking about his dark calling card, the advent of nuclear technology. It began with fission. That was a process that split the atom, releasing an extraordinary amount of deadly energy. Almost immediately, the implications for nuclear technology and warfare were obvious. As Winston Churchill pondered, might not a bomb no bigger than an orange be found to possess a secret power to blast away a city at a stroke? Soon that technology was available. Nuclear chain reactions, nuclear fusion, hydrogen bombs. These advances contain all the keywords of Pluto: destruction, exploitation, the unharnessing of tremendous power, darkness, self-destruction, and the death wish. Why do I add the death wish here? Well, people have always said the sky is falling and the end of the world is coming. But nuclear weapons actually made the end of the world a real possibility. Self-destruction is the toxic streak in Pluto. Nuclear bombs are an expression of a death wish in the collective mind. Pluto has a weakness, you see, a compulsive interest in self-defense. Pluto secretly wants to bring on its own annihilation rather than be killed by something else, anything else. I use 1945 as the end of Pluto's discovery era because on August 6th of that year, a nuclear bomb was used for the very first time in an act of war on the city of Hiroshima. On that date, the planet of tension brought a previously unknown tension into the collective unconscious. If we get real, we have to acknowledge that a worry now slithers in the shared mind, a concern that didn't exist before Pluto came on the scene. That worry is whether or not humans will kill all life in a nuclear winter. Will a few nuclear accidents bring about the same end? It's nothing less than a miracle that such accidents haven't ended life as we know it already. In short, it's no longer possible to think of the future without also considering total annihilation. This is, in my view, the most significant collective psychological change brought to human life by Pluto, and why 1945 is a clear Pluto marker. But let's go back in time again to just after World War I and look at two more Pluto keywords: sexuality and eroticism. Pluto loves to ride the razor's edge between life and death. It loves the titillations of living. And we find that kind of sexuality slinking through the post-World War I landscape. There's an old saying, you can't keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris. Boys left the United States young and naive. They went overseas and experienced struggle, pain, mortality. During the war, they were exposed to many ways of being, exotic women, and different ways of thinking. These young men came back victors, and when they did, they found different women than the ones they'd left behind. This young generation of women had taken male jobs at factories, had dressed in men's clothes, they had earned and controlled their own money, they had lived without husbands and with a lot of freedom. They were used to more worldly responsibility. But the boys and the girls were both ready to cast off the Victorian robes of their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents. They were modern, and they wanted a modern world. It was no wonder suffrage, women's right to vote, passed immediately after World War I, and women were given full rights of citizenry. That was going to, according to suffragettes, result in a cascade of changes in society, and that it did. The time and the environment also created a modern woman called the flapper. This woman showed skin, wore form-fitting dresses, bobbed her hair, and smoked. There were two things going on at the time that helped the flapper along. One was prohibition. An amendment meant to create a sober society by outlawing alcohol just pushed it underground into speakeasies, where flappers could drink bootleg liquor and dance on the tables. There was yet another factor that seemed to create, or at least sustain, both the speakeasy and the flapper. That was jazz. I always say that jazz was created because Pluto needed something to dance to. Pluto's age was the age of jazz. It is as mysterious as Pluto. It has its roots in Black culture of New Orleans. It has a connection to blues and ragtime, and there are some other things about jazz that make it unique, such as improvisation. Jazz is characterized by swing and blue notes and complex chords. Jazz was, in a way, a defense against the difficulties of Black life. It had a sexy, hypnotic effect because it came from the soul. Flappers, jazz, bootleg liquor, independence, rights of citizenry. Once we add the next and most important contribution, we have everything we need to create a free and modern society. But this takes us back. This takes us way back. Women have been in a problematic situation since the dawn of agriculture due to an inability to control their reproduction. Sexual intercourse was likely to result in one pregnancy after the next. Childbirth was a dangerous prospect as well. Many women were killed by childbirth somewhere along the line. Throughout all of history, birth control devices were unreliable or unavailable or based in mythical, non-medical information. So sex meant children and sex meant death. In Pluto's era of discovery, something incredible began to happen. The planet of sex and death actually began to separate sex from mortality by bringing in more reliable and more available birth control. Up until Pluto arrived in the US, talking about sex, birth control, or abortion was illegal, and publishing or circulating such material actually went against obscenity laws. But Pluto came to us and began turning the tide. The right to vote brought an awareness that has never been forgotten. Women's rights socially cannot be separated from maternity. Here I'll tell the story of Margaret Sanger. Her life illustrates in striking detail the pre- and post-Pluto period. Prior to Pluto's discovery era, Margaret Sanger was arrested at least 8 times for obscenity. Nothing was going to stop Margaret Sanger. The importance of birth control was emblazoned in her soul. She was willing to go to jail hundreds of times if it meant that just one woman learned something about contraception. But her work changed considerably in the post-Pluto era. As I said, Pluto brought the right to vote. It brought a more publicly open woman, a generation who would speak in public, a generation of more open young men. So under Pluto's control, obscenity laws began to loosen, and Margaret Sanger was finally able to fulfill her dream, which was to open the very first birth control clinic in America. It was in Brooklyn at 46 Amboy Street. And the entire point of this establishment was to have women come in and learn about their own bodies. After one clinic opened, so did hundreds more. Thanks to Pluto's influence, legalization of birth control suddenly became not a radical fringe idea, but a mainstream, respectable idea, a middle-class idea. Dozens of organizations were formed that offered more effective birth control than ever before, from early sponges and abortion pills to cervical caps, diaphragms, spermicides, copper IUDs, and condoms that were, for the first time, made of latex, an effective material. Birth control was mass manufactured, advertised, easily transported, and available to the public. Margaret Sanger then established the Birth Control League and Planned Parenthood. In short, Pluto brought control over maternity. Of course, motives undulate beneath anything associated with Pluto. So, just as an aside, the birth control movement was often propelled by eugenics. Many of the leaders were actually only interested in birth control and sterilization for the sick, for the poor, for people of color. It would be nice if motives were purely about women's power in society, but that usually isn't the case with Pluto. So now we have destruction, annihilation, the collective unconscious, the masses, sexuality, and control of reproduction. Let us look at another famous Pluto keyword: extremes. There have been many extremes in societies before, but there was never anything like the crash of the American stock market and the Great Depression. Firstly, there was never a stock market like the New York Stock Exchange anywhere on Earth before. Early exchanges in Europe during the previous 600 years didn't actually exchange stocks. They directly traded commodities in local coffee houses. The first true massive collective stock exchange in a central locale was Wall Street. Pluto's era of discovery, 1915 to 1945, brought a wild high and an extreme low surrounding this uniquely modern Plutonic creation. The 20s were called the Roaring 20s because the economy was roaring. Women had more opportunities. There was a lot of employment in factories. Mass consumerism allowed average people to own more. Mass advertising pushed on necessary items, and people bought them, just as we do today. Wall Street was booming. Trading volumes were enormous. Everyone from the banker to the school teacher to the shoe shine boy were all investing. It was a slot machine that was never going to stop paying out, but an underworld was lurking. Most of the luxuries people had purchased were on credit, and people investing in the stock market began a practice called buying on margin. This allowed money to be borrowed from brokers and invested. Investors could then leverage a large amount of borrowed money from a tiny initial investment. In true Pluto style, other people's money was being wagered in enormous amounts. By the end of 1929, the fake wealth of the exchange was unveiled. The Wall Street slot machine threw up a bunch of red flags that people, in their mania, ignored. And on October 29th of 1929, the bubble burst. All the borrowed money had to be paid back immediately, but of course no one had it. Banks collapsed and took everyone's money with them. Regular people lost everything, and they had no assets because they didn't actually own what they had in their homes. This planet of extremes saw a roaring economy plummet into a Great Depression. The Great Depression was a long period of unemployment and poverty. But there's nothing distinctive about this either. Long periods of joblessness and destitution are quite common in the world and through history. So, what was unique about this situation during Pluto's era of discovery? It wasn't the depression itself. It was two other keywords: regeneration and rebirth. Let's explore both of these. The regeneration of America began with the election of Franklin Roosevelt. He minted money and opened the banks. He created a core of government jobs because the private sector wasn't doing it. Franklin Roosevelt unleashed the formerly untapped powers of the government. The U.S. government's powers came into the economy in a way that had never been seen before. But Pluto's dramatic, phoenix-like rebirth didn't come from that. No, it came from yet another war. The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and America had no choice. It was sucked into World War II. Once the boys went overseas, there was no longer an excess in the labor pool stateside, and the government essentially gave every single soldier a job and a paycheck. But the true rebirth came at the end of the war, at the end of Pluto's era of discovery. The United States rose from World War II a superpower because while Europe had been demolished, almost nothing had happened on American soil, and the U.S. population was big enough to withstand the losses of war. Just after the war came a housing boom, an economic boom, a baby boom, a good living wage, and an enormous amount of optimism. At the end of Pluto's discovery era, America stood at the top of the world in terms of wealth, industry, invention, innovation, and a totally intact landscape. Pluto oversaw a multi-layered, multi-feathered rebirth that you never see on such a massive scale. We know that Pluto is associated with life and death. We've talked about death and destruction. Now let's talk about life. During Pluto's era of discovery, we saw a transformation in life, a transformation in medicine, and a transformation in lifespan. From the dawn of time, medicine was crude, and very little was known about what was going on or how anything worked. Pluto brought in the most transformative factor ever found in medicine, and that is the modern antibiotic. This began with specific antibiotics just for certain illnesses, and then wider range sulfa drugs. And finally, Alexander Fleming used a very wide range penicillin for the first time to treat an infection of the eye. Soon it was on the market and jump-started the invention of a wide range of life-saving antibiotics that humans have benefited from ever since. Under Pluto's era, who lived and who died was no longer up to the fates or even the individual constitution. The average lifespan increased from 54 years to 67 years in just the time surrounding the advent of penicillin. This is an enormous leap that has only kept leaping ever since. And ironically, World War II offered many opportunities to try modern medicines and modern procedures on wounded and sick soldiers, so the advances were only sped up by the destruction war was causing. Pluto is the planet of extremes. He has a topside world and an underworld. He gives power with one hand and powerlessness with the other. This is the nature of the God of life and death. As I mentioned at the beginning, I'm only talking about the distinctive things that occurred during Pluto's era of discovery. Other Plutonic events definitely occurred between 1915 and 1945, but they were not distinctive enough to be pinned to the advent of Pluto itself. However, I will go over that material from a different perspective in my next presentation called The Pluto Generations. In that treatment, I'll track this slow-moving planet as it goes through the signs of the zodiac. Whole generations are affected by the long trip it makes through a sign. That sign colors what happens psychologically, socially, and in terms of the likelihood of events. This is a must-watch for any Plutophile, and it's geared toward the intermediate student of astrology. Thanks for tuning in to Secrets from an Astrologer's Desk. Next is all the ways you can get in touch for a personal birth chart reading and full astrological services. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.